In this screencast, we'll cover nouns and an introduction to pronouns. So as we start our parts of speech level, we'll start with nouns, which are probably the most basic part of our language. A noun is a word or word group that is used to name a person, a place, a thing, or an idea. And I think when we first learn about nouns, we learn them as being a person, place, or thing, which are all concrete things, but it's important to remember that they can also refer to abstract ideas like love or duty. Here are some hints to help you identify some nouns. If you see one of these small words, the, a, or an, those are called articles, and those are used to introduce nouns. So they might not directly precede the noun. You might have a word in between. For example, the spotted dog, but the indicates that there's a noun coming up. So that's one way to find them. If you have a word that's capitalized in the middle of your sentence, it's likely a proper noun. If your word can be made plural, so for example, book could become books or child could become children, then it's also a noun. If you see a word that you recognize as an adjective, you would also know that adjectives can modify nouns, so that can help you pick them out. And then finally, prepositions, which we'll get to later in these screencasts, are followed by nouns or also by pronouns. So as you get farther along in this level, those can also help you pick out nouns as well. Here are some examples of some nouns. So when we are referring to a specific person like Mrs. Dusto or Harry Potter, that's a proper noun. If we're referring to a specific place like Arapahoe High School or maybe Argentina, that's another proper noun. We also have common nouns that don't refer to specifics. So we could talk about a toothbrush or a panda. And those are both things. Finally, we could also talk about common nouns that are abstract ideas. So like freedom or love would be a good example of that. Moving on to pronouns then, pronouns stand in for nouns. So you might wonder, why do we even need pronouns? Well, they make language more efficient. So consider the difference between the following sentences. Number 1, John was so excited when John went to New York to see Hamilton. Versus number 2, John was so excited when he went to New York to see Hamilton. The first one, where I repeat John twice, just sounds kind of silly. So pronouns help us to avoid the monotonous repetition of lengthy or compound nouns. I like to think of them as like shortcuts or like understudies for the nouns. And the noun that a pronoun stands in for is called an antecedent. And we can help remember that by breaking down the word itself. So the first part of the word ante actually means before, and then this root in the middle, seed, means go. So in general, an antecedent goes before the pronoun. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, and then in the next screencast, we'll learn about pronouns that don't even have antecedents, but for the most part, the antecedent should precede the pronoun. And finally, we can talk about pronouns by saying that they have person, number, and possession. So by person, I mean first, second, or third person. So think about when we're reading a story that's written in the first person, the narrator would say, I did this, I did that, versus a story in the third person, the narrator might say, he did this or she did that. So that's all that refers to. When we talk about pronouns having number, it just means they can be singular or plural. So I could talk about just me, myself, and say that I ate a donut, or I could talk about all of us as a group and say that we ate donuts. And then finally, their form can change a little bit to show possession. So I could say, that is my donut, or that is her donut. Of course, we don't just want to memorize the definition of pronouns, we also want to consider how they function. So pronouns can function either as subjects or objects. A subject pronoun can be the subject of a clause or used as a subject complement. And don't worry about those terms too much, we'll get there later. But think of subject pronouns as pronouns that can start a sentence. For example, she fell down the stairs after she saw a ghost. Versus saying her fell down the stairs after she saw a ghost. The second one doesn't really make sense. So when we use a subject like she in the subject pronoun position, we call this the nominative case. Now, a pronoun could also be an object where it functions as the object of a sentence or a clause. Object pronouns can be used as direct objects, indirect objects, or objects of prepositions. And again, don't stress out about those, we'll get to them. But as objects, things generally happen to them. Unlike subjects, they're not the ones doing the action. So for example, we would say, Sarah baked a cake for me instead of saying Sarah baked a cake for I. So we call this the object case. Now, all these fancy grammar terms make this sound a lot more complicated than it really is. Here's the general rule. Just try to avoid sounding like a toddler and you'll probably be getting your pronoun case correct. My daughter Evelyn is about to start preschool and she's always very curious about what other people are doing, in the nosy way that little kids get to be. When we're out and about and she sees someone using crutches or maybe kids playing baseball, she'll ask me, Mommy, what are them doing? Now, in that case, she's using them like a subject. Them is referring to the people doing something that she's interested in. So, because she's using the pronoun to refer to people doing something, she should actually use the subject version and instead ask, Mommy, what are they doing? But don't worry, I don't correct her grammar. I'm not that mean yet.